Everyone's heard of the Battle of the Bulge. Most people know it as the last great German offensive of the Second World War. A desperate, brutal push through the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944. A moment where everything seemed to hang by a thread, where American soldiers were surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, and somehow, against all odds, they held. But here's what almost nobody talks about. There was a moment buried inside that battle, a single moment, quiet on paper, catastrophic in practice, where a message was passed down the chain of command and something got lost in translation. Not metaphorically, literally. A German order, passed through a fractured command structure, was misunderstood, mistranslated, or misinterpreted, depending on who you ask. And the result wasn't a minor tactical hiccup. It changed the trajectory of one of the most critical engagements in the entire war. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history that grabs you by the collar and refuses to let go, hit subscribe, because this is what we do. We go past the headlines, past the monuments, past the simplified textbook version, and find the moments that actually shaped what happened. The moments that almost never make the cut. This is one of them. To understand why one mistranslated order mattered so much, you have to understand what the Germans were trying to do in December 1944. Because Operation Watch on the Rhine, the German codename for what became the Battle of the Bulge, wasn't a random gamble. It was a carefully constructed plan, built on a very specific logic, and that logic depended on speed. Speed above everything else. The idea was simple in concept and nightmarish in execution. A massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, a region the Allies considered too difficult for a major offensive. Break through the thin American lines. Push west toward the Meuse River. Capture Antwerp. Split the Allied forces in two. Cut off British and Canadian armies in the north from American forces in the south. Force a negotiated settlement before the full weight of American industrial power crushed Germany into dust. Hitler believed it could work. Many of his generals privately believed it couldn't. But the order came down, and the machine moved. The key to the whole operation was the armored spearhead. And sitting at the tip of that spearhead was the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. To his south was the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. Two very different commanders, with two very different approaches to war. Dietrich was a loyalist, a brawler, a man who had risen through Nazi party ranks, rather than traditional military channels. He was not subtle. He was not a technician of war. Manteuffel was the opposite, precise, methodical, a professional soldier who understood the mechanics of armored warfare at a level that most of his contemporaries envied. And it was within these armies, specifically in the communications and command structures binding them together, that the conditions for disaster were already taking shape before the first shot was fired. The German military in December 1944 was not the machine it had been in 1940. It had been chewed up on the Eastern Front. It had bled itself dry in Normandy. It had lost experienced NCOs, signal operators, translators, liaison officers. The men who made an army function smoothly, the ones who made sure a message sent meant the same thing as a message received, were increasingly rare. And they were being replaced by men who were younger, less experienced, or simply transferred in from different branches, who didn't always share the same terminology, the same shorthand, the same instinctive understanding of what a given order actually meant in practice, on a frozen road in the middle of the night. Now let's talk about Kampfgruppe Piper, because this is where the mistranslated order lives, where it breathed, where it caused its damage. Joachim Piper was 30 years old in December 1944. He was the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, and he had been given the lead element of the entire 6th SS Panzer Army's offensive thrust. His column, Kampfgruppe Piper, was a formidable force: Tiger II tanks, Panther tanks, half-tracks, armored infantry, anti-aircraft vehicles, artillery. It stretched for kilometers. It was designed to punch through the American lines, bypass resistance, and drive west, toward the Meuse, before the Allies could react. Piper's route had been planned by higher command. Roads were designated, timetables were set, fuel depots were theoretically accounted for, and everything depended on moving fast and following those designated routes. Here is where the order enters the picture. In the early hours of the offensive, as the German guns opened their massive preparatory barrage and the armored columns began pushing forward through the darkness and the fog. Piper's column encountered its first serious problem: the roads. The Ardennes road network was not built for heavy armor. Some of the bridges were rated for lighter vehicles. Some of the roads through villages were narrow enough that a king tiger barely fit. Piper had been told his route had been scouted and cleared. It had not been scouted thoroughly, and the first road his column was supposed to use, the road through Losheim, was jammed. Not with enemy troops, with German vehicles, traffic, his own side's logistical chaos, blocking the very route he needed to use. So Piper needed to reroute. This required authorization, communication, and clarity. It required a message to go up the chain of command, a decision to come back down, and alternative routes to be designated and confirmed. And this is where the translation problem enters. Because in the German military command structure of late 1944, particularly in the SS formations, orders were often issued in a mixture of formal Wehrmacht language, SS-specific terminology, and battlefield shorthand that had evolved differently depending on which front a unit had last served on. The Eastern Front had its own vocabulary. The Western Front had developed differently, and the liaison officers passing messages between headquarters and forward units were not always fluent in both. The specific order in question concerned Piper's alternate route. He had requested authorization to deviate from his assigned axis of advance and move through a different series of roads that he believed would allow him to bypass the congestion and get his column moving again. The response that came back from higher headquarters used phrasing that was understood at the sending end as a conditional authorization. Move through the alternate route if the primary route remains impassable for more than a set period of time. Wait for confirmation before committing the full column. What reached Piper's command vehicle, filtered through at least one relay point, and communicated verbally by a liaison officer who had been awake for over 30 hours, was something functionally different. It was understood as a general authorization to proceed via the alternate route at Piper's discretion. The conditional element, the waiting period, the requirement for additional confirmation, none of that survived the transmission, and Piper, being the kind of commander he was, a man whose entire operational philosophy was built on momentum and speed, took the authorization and moved. He pushed his column south. He took the route through Lignoville and then turned north, toward Stavelot, and for a few hours, on December 17, 1944, Kampfgruppe Piper was moving with terrifying speed. The roads were better. The column was rolling. It looked like the breakthrough might actually happen, but the route change had consequences that rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. Because Piper's original route had not just been chosen for its road quality, it had been chosen because it passed near specific fuel depots, American fuel depots that the Germans had planned to capture to sustain the advance. Without American fuel, the German attack would run on what the panzers were carrying in their tanks, and that margin was extremely tight. The German planners knew this. They had factored it in. But when Piper deviated from his route, based on the mistranslated, misunderstood order, he also deviated away from those fuel depots. He didn't know it. Nobody told him, because nobody who passed him the authorization understood that the route change wasn't just a geographic decision, it was a logistical one. And so Kampfgruppe Piper continued its drive west, burning fuel it could not replace, moving with speed that consumed what little margin it had, heading toward a point of no return that nobody in the chain of command had seen coming, because nobody in the chain of command had the full picture. The man who gave the order didn't know it had been misinterpreted. The man who received the order didn't know he'd received a different one. And the logistics officers, who might have flagged the problem, were not looped into the communication at all. This is how battles are lost. Not always in the dramatic collision of armies, not always in the failure of a grand plan, but in the quiet, almost invisible gaps between what one person meant and what another person understood, in the 30-second verbal relay of a written message that loses a clause somewhere between the signals tent and the tank commander's headset. Let's stay with Piper a little longer, because his column's movement through Belgium in those first days of the offensive tells you everything about how the mistranslation multiplied its consequences. By the time Kampfgruppe Piper reached the crossroads at Bauchnez on December 17th, it had already left a trail of chaos behind it. American supply lines were disrupted, rear area units were in panic, and the sheer speed of the German advance had created exactly the kind of confusion that the Wehrmacht planners had hoped for. But Piper was also burning through his fuel at a rate that was becoming alarming even to him. He had pushed too hard, too fast. He needed the depots, he needed replenishment, and he was not going to get it because he was on the wrong road. At Baugnez, his forces captured a convoy of American soldiers, and here, at this crossroads, in a field near Malmedy, one of the most infamous atrocities of the Western Front took place. Captured American prisoners, somewhere between 80 and 90 men, were murdered in cold blood. The Malmedy massacre. It sent shockwaves through the Allied command. It hardened American resistance. It made soldiers who might have surrendered in desperate situations think twice. It was also, in a grim irony, partly a product of the pressure Piper was under. He couldn't afford prisoners. He couldn't afford delays. He was already behind the timetable that the mistranslated authorization had set him on, and every hour mattered. The massacre was a war crime without qualification, but its context, the frantic, fuel-starved, time-pressured advance of a column that was already beginning to run off the rails, is inseparable from the order that set it in motion. Piper was a man who had committed atrocities before on the Eastern Front. He was capable of it, regardless of circumstance. But the specific conditions of December 17th, the fuel crisis, the route deviation, the sense that the window of opportunity was already closing, those conditions were downstream of the miscommunication that had sent him south instead of north 24 hours earlier. Now let's zoom out, because the effects of Piper's rerouting were felt far beyond his own column. The German offensive on December 16th and 17th hit the American lines in several places simultaneously. The 99th Infantry Division in the north took a tremendous blow, but held. The 106th Infantry Division in the center, positioned on the Schnee Eifel, was encircled and forced to surrender in the largest mass surrender of American troops since the Civil War. The 28th Infantry Division in the south bent and bled and gave ground but didn't break. And in the middle of all this chaos, the question of where the primary German armored effort was actually going became absolutely critical to the Allied response. Chefef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, needed to know where Piper was. They needed to know where the main thrust was directed. Was it going toward Liège? Toward the Meuse? Toward Namur? The answer would determine where to shift reserves, where to position the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions that Eisenhower was preparing to throw into the battle. It would determine whether St. Vith or Bastogne was the more critical point to reinforce. It would shape everything. And the intelligence picture being built by Allied commanders in those critical first 48 hours was being pieced together largely from fragments. Captured German soldiers, intercepted signals, reports from retreating American units, and every piece of that picture was pointing to Piper's column as the tip of the main effort. But Piper was no longer where the original German plan said he would be. He was on a different route. He was moving through different terrain, and the Allied intelligence officers tracking his axis of advance were, in the first day, building their models on where they expected him, based on the original German plan, not on where he actually was, because of the unauthorized, misunderstood route change. This created a window of confusion in Allied decision-making at exactly the moment when clarity was most desperately needed. It wasn't total confusion. The Americans were not paralyzed, but the time it took to reorient, to realize that Piper was not where he was supposed to be, to update the picture, and redirect the response, that time had value. Hours matter in mobile warfare. In the kind of fluid, fast-moving battle the Ardennes had become in those first days, hours translated directly into kilometers, into ground gained or lost, into road junctions seized or defended, into the question of whether the Germans could reach the Meuse before the Allies could seal the flanks. And here's the thing about Stavelot. When Piper's column reached Stavelot on the night of December 17th to 18th, there was a massive American fuel depot there. It held somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 million gallons of gasoline. If Piper had captured that fuel, the entire logistical calculation of the German offensive changes. His column could have refueled, pushed forward, and the race to the Meuse becomes a very different contest. He knew it was there, he attacked toward it, and he came agonizingly close. American defenders, a small force that had no right to stop him, managed to set the depot on fire before he could capture it intact. Piper watched the fuel burn. He pushed part of his column into Stavelot, but couldn't hold it. American counterattacks from the 117th Infantry Regiment pushed back, and then the bridge at Stavelot was blown in front of him, effectively cutting his column off from its own supply line. Kampfgruppe Piper was now operating deep in enemy territory, encircled effectively from the rear, with almost no fuel and no way to get more. He had reached La Glaise. He had pushed probes toward Stoumont. He had gotten closer to the Meuse than any other German unit would during the entire offensive, and then he stopped. Not because of American firepower alone, though that was immense, not because of the weather, though that was brutal, but because his tanks were running out of fuel, because the logistical thread that was supposed to sustain him had been cut, partly by circumstances, partly by American defensive action, and partly by the route deviation that had taken him away from the planned resupply points in the first crucial hours when the column still had momentum. On December 23rd and 24th, with his column surrounded, his tanks out of fuel, his men out of ammunition, and no relief coming, Piper gave the order to destroy the vehicles and break out on foot. Over 800 men made it back to German lines through the forests in the dead of winter. He left behind 42 tanks, dozens of armored vehicles, and the burning wreckage of what had been the greatest hope of the German offensive. Kampfgruppe Piper ceased to exist as a fighting force. And the question that haunts the whole story is simple. What if the order had been communicated correctly? What if Piper had waited? What if he had used his original route, stayed closer to the planned fuel depots, and given the German logistics chain time to establish a supply line behind him? The fuel at Stavelot might have been reachable in time. The American defenders might not have had the hours they needed to organize a coherent response. The 82nd Airborne, which was rushed to block exactly the axis that Piper was pushing, might have arrived to find him already past the critical choke points. Nobody can say for certain that a correctly transmitted order would have put German tanks on the Meuse. The Allies had advantages in numbers, in air power once the weather cleared, and in the sheer stubborn determination of American soldiers who refused to give ground even when the situation was tactically hopeless. The Battle of the Bulge was never going to be a German victory in any realistic strategic sense, but it could have been worse. The margin between what happened and what almost happened was thinner than most people realize, and inside that margin, right at its edge, sits the miscommunicated order that sent Piper south instead of north, and put his column on a road that led to La Glaise instead of the Meuse. Now let's talk about what was happening on the other side of the battle. Because the American response to the German offensive is its own story of communication, confusion, and the enormous difference that one clear order can make. When the German attack began, on December 16th, the American command structure was genuinely caught off guard. Not entirely surprised, there had been some intelligence indicators that something was building in the German rear, but the scale of the attack and the specific direction of the thrust was not anticipated. The Ardennes was held thinly precisely because it was considered unsuitable for major armored operations. The Americans had made the same mistake the French had made in 1940. They had decided the terrain prevented an attack and positioned their forces accordingly. The initial reports coming into First Army headquarters at Spa were fragmentary and alarming. General Courtney Hodges, commanding First Army, was trying to build a picture of what was happening across a front that was now simultaneously on fire in a dozen different places. The communication systems were being stressed. German infiltrators, part of Operation Grafe, under Otto Skorzeny, were dressed in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps, and cutting telephone lines, changing road signs, and spreading confusion deep in the American rear. The psychological impact was enormous. Every American soldier who encountered an unknown vehicle or an unfamiliar face in those early days was operating in a fog of uncertainty that made clear communication exponentially harder. Into this chaos came General Eisenhower's response. And here, in contrast to the German failure of communication, you see how decisive leadership and clear command authority can cut through confusion like a blade. Eisenhower met with his senior commanders on December 19th at Verdun, a meeting held in a cold, drafty room in a French barracks. It became one of the most consequential command conferences of the entire war, and what Eisenhower said, the tone he set, the clarity with which he identified the problem and the solution, was itself a kind of antidote to everything the German miscommunication had produced. He told his commanders this was an opportunity, not a crisis. The Germans had come out from behind their defenses. They were in the open. The task was to stop them, let them exhaust themselves against American resistance, and then destroy them. He made 2 decisions at that meeting that would define the battle. First, he sent the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne. Second, he gave General George Patton authority to turn the Third Army 90 degrees north and drive into the southern shoulder of the German Bulge. Patton's response is legendary. He claimed he could have 3 divisions moving north within 48 hours. Eisenhower thought he was boasting. He wasn't. The Third Army had already been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of contingency, because Patton was the kind of commander who was always thinking 3 moves ahead. When the orders came, the machine was ready to execute. And here is the contrast. On the German side, a single misunderstood order had sent the tip of the main offensive spear onto a different road, with cascading consequences that nobody in the chain of command could see or correct. On the American side, clear orders issued with confidence by a commander who understood the full picture were being received, understood, and executed by subordinates who trusted the intent and acted on it with initiative and energy. 2 command cultures, 2 communication outcomes, and ultimately, 2 very different results on the battlefield. Bastogne deserves its own examination, because the defense of that crossroads town is both the most famous episode of the Battle of the Bulge and a perfect illustration of how communication clarity can function as a force multiplier. The 101st Airborne Division arrived in Bastogne without full equipment, without adequate winter clothing, with limited ammunition, and with no clear perimeter to defend, because the situation was still fluid when they arrived. General Anthony McAuliffe was in command in Bastogne, and the position he found himself in by December 20th and 21st was, by any conventional military analysis, close to hopeless. His division was surrounded. The Germans had complete encirclement of the town. Supply couldn't get in. Reinforcement couldn't reach him. The weather had grounded Allied air power, and the German forces ringing Bastogne were substantial. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a flag of truce. They delivered a formal written demand for the surrender of Bastogne. The message, translated into English by a German officer, was polished and formal. It warned of annihilation if the Americans did not surrender. It offered honorable treatment. It was a genuine military communication, properly delivered. McAuliffe's response has gone down in history as perhaps the single most famous communication of the entire war in the Western theater. He wrote one word: nuts. The German officers, upon receiving this reply, asked the American officer who delivered it whether the answer was affirmative or negative. The American officer, Major Alvin Jones, reportedly told them it was decidedly not affirmative. The Germans withdrew, presumably to try to figure out what a one-word response, consisting of an informal American profanity, actually meant in the context of military communication. They concluded it meant rejection. McAuliffe's response was clear. It was unambiguous. It required no translation beyond the cultural. And it communicated not just a decision, but a psychological state. These men were not going to surrender. They were not broken. They were not afraid. The word was a message not just to the German commanders outside the perimeter, but to every American soldier inside it. We are staying. We are fighting. This ground is ours. The contrast to the German communication failure could not be more stark. Where a German order had lost its conditional clause in transmission and set a column on the wrong road to a fuel-starved dead end, an American commander's one-word reply cut through all possible ambiguity and sent a message that reverberated through the battle on both sides of the wire. Now let's address something that gets lost in the popular narrative of the Battle of the Bulge, which tends to focus on American heroism and German failure, without fully accounting for just how close it actually was. Because it was close. It was dangerously, uncomfortably close. And the people on the ground knew it, in a way that the clean historical retrospective sometimes obscures. The weather was a decisive factor. From December 16th until December 23rd, the Ardennes was locked in fog, cloud, and precipitation that grounded Allied air power almost completely. This was not an accident. The German planners had deliberately timed the offensive to coincide with a period of bad weather precisely because they knew that Allied air superiority was a fundamental problem for any armored advance. Without tactical air support, the American infantry defending thin lines against massed German armor was fighting at a significant disadvantage. The air was supposed to be an Allied weapon. For the first week of the battle, it wasn't. When the weather finally broke on December 23rd and the skies cleared, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, and British Typhoons among them, swarmed the German columns. Supply lines that had already been struggling became untenable. The fuel crisis that Piper's column was experiencing was replicated across the German offensive. Roads were attacked, bridges were hit, columns that had been moving with some degree of confidence became trapped in traffic jams of burning vehicles. The air power that had been a theoretical Allied advantage became a concrete, war-shaping reality almost overnight. But here's what matters about those 7 days of bad weather. If the German offensive had been moving with the coherence and speed its planners intended, 7 days of grounded Allied air power might have been enough. 7 days for Piper's column to capture fuel and push to the Meuse. 7 days for the 5th Panzer Army to seize Bastogne and open the roads west. 7 days for the German armored spearheads to get close enough to Antwerp that the subsequent Allied response, even with air power restored, would have faced a fundamentally different situation. The miscommunicated order didn't just send Piper on the wrong road. It compressed the timeline in ways that rippled across the entire German offensive. Because Piper was the tip of the spear, and when the tip of the spear gets blunted and confused in the first 48 hours, the entire thrust loses its momentum. Other units that were supposed to follow and exploit the breakthrough Piper was supposed to create found themselves pushing into terrain that hadn't been cleared, facing resistance that hadn't been bypassed, losing hours and fuel and men in engagements that the plan had assumed would never happen because Piper was supposed to have already blown through them. The 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel actually performed better in the early days than the 6th SS Panzer Army, partly because Manteuffel was a better tactical commander and partly because his communications discipline was tighter. His units made significant progress. They encircled Bastogne, they pushed further west than any other German formation, and they came closer to the Meuse than any unit except Piper's column in its brief, frantic drive on December 17th. But without the northern shoulder tearing open the way the plan required, the 5th Panzer Army was advancing into a strategic vacuum rather than exploiting a decisive breakthrough. And here is where the question of what one mistranslated order actually changed becomes most stark. If Piper had followed his original route, if his column had been moving correctly in those first 24 hours, if the northern shoulder of the offensive had been tearing forward at the speed and along the axis that the German planners intended, the pressure on the Allied command structure would have been different in kind, not just in degree. The 82nd Airborne, which was positioned to block Piper's axis of advance, might have been needed elsewhere. The fuel depot at Stavelot, which was set on fire by American defenders with barely hours to spare, might not have had those hours. The thin American units, holding the roads that Piper should have been using, might have been bypassed rather than engaged, freeing them to resist elsewhere or simply leaving them stranded in a German rear area. None of this guarantees a German success. The Allied reserves were coming. Patton was already turning north. The weight of Allied industrial production and manpower was already on the march toward the Bulge. But the difference between a German offensive that creates a genuine crisis requiring weeks to resolve and one that creates a dangerous situation requiring 10 days to stabilize is enormous in strategic and human terms. It's the difference between a German army that bleeds itself white against a stable Allied front and one that gets far enough west to complicate the Allied command structure in ways that take months to unravel. We will never know exactly how far the difference might have stretched. History doesn't run the alternate timeline, but the historians who have studied the Battle of the Bulge most carefully are consistent on one point. The margin by which the German offensive failed to achieve even its minimum objectives was smaller than the popular narrative suggests. And inside that margin, the confused, misunderstood order that sent Piper on the wrong road in the first hours of the battle was one of the significant weights on the Allied side of the scale. Let's talk about Piper himself, because his story after La Glaise is as remarkable and troubling as everything that came before it. He broke out of the encirclement at La Glaise on foot, with over 800 men. He made it back to German lines. He continued to fight in the West, and was still in combat when the war ended. After the war, he was tried by an American military tribunal as part of the Malmedy massacre proceedings. He was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted. He served a prison sentence and was released in 1956. He lived in relative obscurity in Germany for a time, then moved to France, to a small village called Traves. His past followed him. In 1976, on the night of July 13th to 14th, Bastille Day, his house was set on fire. His body was found in the ruins. He was 60 years old. Who killed him has never been officially determined, though suspicion has generally centered on French resistance veterans or their descendants. Piper was, by any honest accounting, a war criminal. The massacre at Malmedy was not the only atrocity his forces committed in December 1944. His unit's record on the Eastern Front was equally brutal. He was a creature of the SS, shaped by an ideology that treated human life as subordinate to military and political objectives. None of that is in dispute. But his role in the story of the Battle of the Bulge is also, separate from his moral character, the story of a commander operating in a communications environment that had already failed him before the first tank crossed the start line. He was moving on orders he believed were correct. He was making decisions based on information that was incomplete. He was operating in the kind of fog of war that the German command structure of late 1944 was generating almost as a structural feature, not as an exception. The mistranslated order didn't make Piper a war criminal. It found a war criminal already in motion and pointed him slightly differently, and in doing so, it bent the arc of the entire offensive. Now let's pull back even further and look at the broader context of communication failure in the Second World War, because Piper's story is not unique. It's one of many instances where the gap between what was ordered and what was understood determined the outcome of military action. Military historians have long recognized that the fog of war is not primarily a product of enemy action. It is primarily a product of communication failure within one's own command structure. The German army of the Second World War, despite its reputation for operational excellence, was particularly vulnerable to this problem in its later years because of several structural factors that the Battle of the Bulge brought to a violent point of convergence. The first factor was the loss of experienced signal personnel. The men who ran the radio networks, who maintained the landlines, who served as liaison officers and messengers, were being consumed by attrition at a rate that could not be replaced with equivalent quality. The training pipelines were compressed. The experienced hands who knew how to phrase an order so that it survived transmission through multiple relay points were being replaced by men who had learned the technical skills but not always the professional instincts that went with them. The second factor was the deliberate compartmentalization of information by German higher command, specifically by Hitler himself. Operation Watch on the Rhine was planned under conditions of extreme secrecy. Many of the officers who would have to execute the plan were not briefed on its full scope until very late. This meant that commanders in the field were operating with limited understanding of how their piece fit into the larger puzzle. When something went wrong, they often didn't have the context to understand the full implications of a deviation. Piper didn't know that his route change had separated him from planned fuel depots in the way that it did, partly because the full logistical picture had not been shared down to his level in the way it needed to be. The third factor was the stress of exhaustion. By December 1944, the German army on the Western Front had been fighting continuously since Normandy. The men and officers at every level were tired in ways that peacetime experience cannot adequately convey. Exhaustion degrades communication. It degrades listening. It degrades the careful parsing of conditional language that might save a unit from moving in the wrong direction. A liaison officer who has been awake for 30 hours is not reading a message with the same precision as a rested one. A commander receiving a verbal relay of a written order at 2 in the morning after a day of driving and fighting is not parsing it with the same care as he would sitting in a quiet headquarters with a map and a cup of coffee. These three factors combined to create a command environment in which the kind of small but critical error that sent Piper on the wrong road was not an aberration. It was almost inevitable, somewhere in the plan. The only questions were where and how much damage it would do when it arrived. The American side had its own communication problems in December 1944. The initial chaos of the German breakthrough generated genuine confusion in the American command structure. There were moments in the first 48 hours when critical information was not flowing effectively between units and headquarters. There were cases of units being cut off from communication entirely. There were instances of orders being issued on the basis of information that was already hours out of date. The fog of war does not discriminate, but the American command culture of 1944 had a significant structural advantage over the German one. It was built on what military theorists call mission command, or at least a version of it. Commanders were given objectives and trusted to find ways to achieve them. Lower-level commanders had significant latitude to act on their own initiative when communication with higher headquarters was impossible or delayed. This meant that when the system broke down, as it inevitably did in the chaos of December 1944, individual commanders at the battalion and regimental level could make decisions that preserved the coherence of the defense even without continuous guidance from above. The defense of St. Vith is an example of this. General Bruce Clark of the 7th Armored Division and the scattered American units around St. Vith held that road junction for far longer than any rational analysis of the balance of forces would have predicted, and they did it largely on their own initiative, improvising defensive positions, coordinating between units that weren't formally under a single command structure, and buying time that proved critical to the Allied response. Nobody told them exactly how to do it. They were told the ground mattered, and they held it, using the initiative and flexibility that the American military culture of the time empowered them to exercise. This is the real lesson of the communication story inside the Battle of the Bulge. It's not just that one order was mistranslated. It's that the German command system in December 1944 was brittle in ways that made individual communication failures catastrophic, while the American system, for all its confusion and imperfection, was resilient in ways that made individual communication failures survivable and sometimes even recoverable. A brittle system breaks when stressed. A resilient one bends. The Ardennes in December 1944 was maximum stress applied to both systems simultaneously. One bent, one broke. Now let's go to the question that lingers over everything else in this story. Why don't we talk about this more? The Battle of the Bulge has been told and retold in film, in books, in documentaries, in video games. It's one of the most covered military engagements in the history of the Second World War. HBO made a miniseries about it. Ken Burns has covered the broader war. Steven Spielberg produced an extended dramatic treatment. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne is iconic. Patton's relief of Bastogne is iconic. The German failure is usually explained in terms of strategic overreach, Allied air superiority, American stubbornness, and the simple reality that Germany didn't have the resources to win a battle of this scale in 1944. All of that is true, but the role of a specific, documentable communication failure in shaping the early trajectory of the German offensive is significantly underexplored in the popular narrative. It doesn't fit neatly into the story we prefer to tell, which is a story about grand strategy and human courage, rather than about the prosaic, invisible, unglamorous reality that battles are often decided by the quality of the information flowing through a command structure in the hours before the shooting starts. Military historians who specialize in the campaign, men and women who have spent decades working through the German and American archival records, the unit diaries, the after-action reports, the interrogation transcripts, the signals logs, are much more aware of this layer of the story. They know that the German offensive didn't simply fail because it was strategically foolish, though it was. They know it failed partly because of specific, identifiable moments where the command and communication systems that were supposed to make the plan work instead undermined it. The route change that Piper executed, based on a misunderstood order, is one of those moments. It is documented, it is specific, and its consequences are traceable through the subsequent events of the battle in ways that are not speculative, but empirically grounded. The reason it doesn't get more attention is partly that it's hard to dramatize. A mistranslated order doesn't have the narrative arc of a heroic stand or a dramatic reversal. It's a quiet thing. It happens in a signals tent, or on a radio net, or in the exhausted verbal relay of a message between two officers standing next to a tank in the dark. You can't put a camera on it. You can't build a scene around it in the way you can build one around the defense of Bastogne or Patton's Drive North. It requires the viewer or the reader to understand context, to appreciate logistics, to care about the difference between a conditional authorization and an unconditional one. That's a harder sell than a one-word reply to a surrender demand. But the military reality is that these quiet moments, these invisible failures of communication, matter enormously. Sometimes they matter more than the dramatic moments that get all the attention. And the Battle of the Bulge, for all the drama of Bastogne and the 101st and Patton's Drive and the clearing skies of December 23rd, was also fundamentally shaped by a message that lost a clause somewhere between a German headquarters and a tank commander's earpiece in the frozen dark of December 17, 1944. There's another dimension to this story that deserves attention, and that's what it tells us about the nature of language itself under conditions of extreme stress, in a multilingual, multinational conflict conducted across national, cultural, and organizational boundaries that the participants themselves were often only partially aware of. The German military of the Second World War was not a monolith. It was a complex, stratified organization made up of the traditional Wehrmacht, the SS formations with their own separate command structure and culture, the Luftwaffe ground forces, the Waffen-SS, and the various national formations recruited from occupied territories and allied nations. Each of these organizations had its own internal language, its own terminology, its own shorthand, and in 1944, they were increasingly mixed together, increasingly dependent on each other, increasingly communicating across the boundaries that had previously kept them separate. The 6th SS Panzer Army was an SS formation, communicating with Wehrmacht logistics, coordinating with Luftwaffe support that wasn't coming, and receiving orders from a higher command that had planned the operation using Wehrmacht operational doctrine, but was implementing it through SS commanders who had developed their own operational vocabulary on the Eastern Front. The potential for messages to lose precision in this environment was not a theoretical risk, it was a structural feature of the organization conducting the operation. When the order about Piper's route deviation passed through this environment, it was passing not just from one place to another, but from one organizational culture to another, from one set of linguistic and professional assumptions to another. The officer who drafted